Conversations, a series of short interviews about our areas of expertise and other timely topics that we're seeing in the world through the lens of strategic communications. Today we're speaking with August's co-founder and CEO Steven Goldberg about financial restructurings and Chapter 11 cases and the importance of having effective communications throughout the restructuring process. Steven, as he will tell you, has extensive restructuring experience, both as an attorney and as a communications advisor, and he has worked on some of the most high-profile cases in history. With that brief background, let's get into it. Steven, it's great to be speaking with you about this topic. To get us started, can you please tell us, how did you first get into this line of work?
Well, thanks, Matt. I'm excited to be talking about this topic as well. It's something that's been part of my professional career since day one. Financial restructurings is an area of the law that I got into kind of by chance. Out of law school, I worked at a law firm that had a big bankruptcy Chapter 11 practice, and got involved doing some work with their group as a summer associate, and liked it enough to start there when I started my career as a full-time lawyer. And I practiced for about 8 years. A lot of the work that I did was on the debtor side, representing big companies going through Chapter 11 cases. And I found that what I loved about restructurings was it was kind of a lens into what makes corporations work or not work from a financial and operational perspective. And so as a lawyer, I really enjoyed learning about the corporate world, again, finance, legal, operational, and I practiced for about 8 years and then decided that being a lawyer wasn't what I wanted to do for the rest of my career, and I didn't want to abandon everything I had done and learned as a lawyer. And without going into a lot of detail, I ended up in strategic communications at the beginning of my career, doing almost exclusively work on behalf of companies in financial distress or going through Chapter 11 cases. And that was about almost 21 years ago.
I know you mentioned to me before that, when you started getting into this line of work, it was a very busy period of time in the corporate restructurings and Chapter 11 cases. Can you just talk briefly about what was going on at that time?
Yeah, when I got into this work, it was right after 9/11. It was the beginning of 2002. There was a recession. It had just been a tech crash. And there were a lot of very high-profile Chapter 11 cases. If you go back more than 20 years, it was time of Enron and Adelphia and WorldCom. There were a number of energy and airline bankruptcies. And back in those days, Chapter 11 cases were very complex. Very often they would take years, involving lots of legal and financial issues. It was probably a good time to get into this business because I learned a lot about strategic communications through an area of strength, which was my knowledge of financial communication, financial restructurings. And being able to get into the strategic and financial communications through something that I knew really helped me have the confidence to build my career as a strategic communications practitioner.
So throughout your career in both, as an attorney and communications with respect to these financial restructurings, have you seen that there are heightened periods of time of activity, or do you think restructurings are following some sort of cycle, or do you think something else is at play here?
I think for many years there were financial, economic cycles that led to more financial restructurings. For the past 10 or 15 years, everybody's talking about the next wave of restructurings, and other than post-financial crisis, there really hasn't been cycles or waves. Lots of people thought there would be a huge wave after COVID. There was a little bit of a increase in activity for companies that were in significant financial distress, that COVID kind of pushed them over the edge. But I still think a lot of people who have been in this profession, whether it's for a long time or recently, are still waiting for the next wave. And so I think perhaps what the last several years has shown is not really so much cycles, but there need to be the right factors to drive companies to take this action. And for a long time, there haven't been those conditions. Credit's been relatively easy to get. And when companies have different alternatives to refinance their balance sheets, Chapter 11 is usually a last resort. So what we've seen, I think, over the last couple of years, other than COVID, the companies that have gone through Chapter 11 primarily are the ones that are using it for strategic reasons. So the mass tort bankruptcies, Johnson & Johnson, Boy Scouts of America, et cetera, where it's driven by legal and strategic reasons more than financial.
It seems that the economic circumstances are changing a bit right now with inflation. Cost of borrowing is not what it was even a year ago. Do you think that's going to change the opportunistic nature of how companies look at bankruptcies and Chapter 11 cases?
I think after the last decade or so, I think people are afraid to predict a huge wave of bankruptcies at any time, or Chapter 11 filings. However, I think now is probably a likely a time there has been in recent years to expect a significant wave of restructurings, primarily because of the interest rate environment and the decreasing availability of capital. So if you think about what I just said, which is when companies have opportunities to refinance cheaply and there's lots of money in the system to bail companies out of financial distress, Chapter 11s are going to be very low. That equation is changing because the amount of money that's available and the cost of borrowing that money is significantly different, as you said, than even was a year ago. If interest rates continue to rise, if there continues to be the impact of COVID on supply chain and on consumer behavior, I think you're going to see within 6 to 12 months a significant wave. Very often you see a wave of restructurings after a holiday season. When I got into this business, I went into the legal business more than 25 years ago. What very often drove restructurings was how did a company do during the holiday season? There were a lot of retail bankruptcies and other businesses that were very dependent upon activity during the holiday season. I think you might see a significant wave of bankruptcies at the beginning of 2023 and throughout the course of next year.
If companies now are thinking that they're going to wait for the holiday season or another moment in time to see how things go to kind of be this go no go decision on a restructuring, at what point are they obligated or should they start to communicate to their stakeholders about where they are and what's riding on that event?
One of the most challenging things about communicating when you're in financial distress is that there's great uncertainty about the path forward, whether a formal restructuring, either out of court or in court, will be necessary. And once there's speculation about it, trying to communicate and provide assurance to employees and other stakeholders becomes very difficult, because in a crisis or a strategic situation, what you're trying to achieve, what companies are trying to achieve, and we're trying to advise our clients on, is how to provide some degree of certainty or assurance to those stakeholders. When there's not a clear path forward, it makes it much more difficult. The best you can do in those situations is provide assurance that it's being addressed and that whatever course of action the company takes is going to be what is deemed to be in the best interest of its stakeholders. And if you can provide that assurance and comfort your stakeholders that you're on top of the situation and have their best interest in mind, it's really the only way to maintain credibility and effectively communicate during a period of uncertainty. So I think to answer your question, I think that's what companies should be focused on, is not over-promising, but being aware of the concerns of its stakeholders, trying to address them to the best of their ability without over-promising, but providing a degree of assurance that there's a focus on their best interests.
So I think that's That's interesting. We're talking about the before things really go south, kind of planning for what if, and the role of communications is to provide those assurances that you do have their best interests in mind, and there being all the various stakeholders of the company. So where do you see the role of communications, shifting from those early moments where there could be something to when, you're pretty certain that there's going to be a restructuring or a Chapter 11 filing, up until the filing and then in the moments following? How does communications?
Yeah, it's a little ironic actually, and it's kind of interesting dichotomy, which is that in the period leading up to Chapter 11, very often our advice is what you can't say, because it will create problems down the road if you do have to file, or if not. If you try to overpromise, or if you try to communicate when there's not certainty, it can cause significant reputational and credibility problems for a management team and for the company. So in that period leading up, you're very often trying to find the line at which you can't go beyond that in terms of communicating with detail. Once you transition to the period where now you're communicating a legal act and in many cases a financial transaction, now you want to provide as much detail as possible about what's happening and why. So you shift from saying, here's what you can't say too much, to here's what you need to say, and here are the details you need to provide, and here are the assurances to address the what about me questions that your stakeholders have. And that actually is one of the things that I find most challenging and interesting, and why I've enjoyed being in this industry for so long, is that a financial restructuring, and very often we're talking about a Chapter 11 filing, is kind of a crisis wrapped up in a financial transaction. So you've got both pieces of kind of what are the core of what we do in strategic communications. There's the financial piece and the crisis piece. And particularly when you're announcing a Chapter 11 filing, putting those sets of skills together is for us, it's a fun challenge. I know for our clients that are going through it, fun's not the word you want to use, but it is one of the few times that you're trying to put those two pieces together, addressing the crisis and also communicating a financial transaction that is complex and has technicalities that need to be communicated with specificity.
Got it. That's interesting to look at it as the two prongs, the financial transaction and the crisis there. So you talked about the need to communicate, the role of communications. Now, to who are we, most focused on communicating? Who are some of the usual stakeholders that we're looking to talk to in any restructuring or Chapter 11 case?
Usually the same constituents as you would in any crisis or strategic situation or financial transaction. Usually starts with employees. Some cases it's investors, although in Chapter 11 cases, investors may be the least important stakeholder given their position in the capital structure. Obviously customers, business partners, vendors and suppliers, and then of course making sure the message gets across with the media. So depending upon the company and the industry, there may be other stakeholders such as landlords. There could be, if it's an educational institution, alumni. For in the healthcare industry, it could be doctors and insurance providers. But for the most part, it's your business partners, employees, and the media. And what's interesting is that depending upon the nature of the company and its industry, different stakeholders could be more important in terms of communications and having a successful restructuring. Employees are almost always critical. You can't be losing all of your employees in the midst of a Chapter 11 scenario. In some cases, though, vendors could be extremely critical, as it might be in a retail business, where if you don't have your key vendors continuing to provide you with the merchandise you sell, then you're out of business. So in some cases, it could be your vendors are your most important constituent. In some cases, it could be your customers. In some cases, it could be your employees. They're all important, but the degree to which you have to focus on each one may vary and depending upon the company and the industry.
And you made reference to the, what about me questions. Can you just talk about, pick a couple of stakeholder groups that we've just run through it, and what are their burning questions? What do they care about most?
They're fairly obvious. Will I get paid? Are you going to, if I'm an employee, am I going to continue to get my compensation? If I'm a vendor, you're going to continue to pay me for what I send you. If I'm a customer, am I going to continue to get what you provide to me? The skill is understanding what are the potential not obvious what about me questions you need to ask about and make sure you address. So again, based on the company, what kind of benefits do the employees have? What's their reporting structure? Do they sit at a desk where they can get emails and or do they, are they out on the road, and do they have other ways of receiving information? You have to think about not only how to address their "what about me" questions, but how you're going to communicate those answers to them. So the real skill and what we bring to the table is helping clients figure out what the "what about me" questions are, and then what's the best way to answer those depending upon the constituent, how they typically are communicated with.
So I think it sounds like to get those right, the most pressing "what about me" questions, responded to correctly or preempted. I think it sounds like it takes a high degree of collaboration with the company and likely with legal counsel, just to make sure that we as the communicators understand how things are done with the company in an ordinary course, but also being aware of, this is a legal situation, a crisis situation, and there are litigation elements that need to be considered. So as communicators, we can't just go out and say, or provide answers to "what about me" questions. I think it's probably strikes more of a balance between what you refer to as the crisis part, more of a litigation issue, and the transaction issue.
Yeah, I think that our role is to be the connective piece between the company and its other advisors. The legal and financial advisors are very focused on getting the filing done properly, putting the deal in place. The company is focused on all of, is the operational, legal, financial, communications. The company likely hasn't been through it before. Their management team probably doesn't know all the right questions to ask to have an effective communications plan and messaging. The lawyers and financial advisors have been through it, and they know the right questions to ask, but their attention is diverted. So our job is to make sure we put those two pieces together and say, we need to ask the company the right questions to know what do we need to find out from the lawyers and financial advisors about what we can say about those things. And I'll give you an example. If your vendors are a key constituent, and we need to make sure we address vendors' concerns as clearly as possible, we need to understand what the nature of the relationship is and what issues we need to address. But we also need to know from a legal standpoint, what are we asking the court for authority to do in terms of paying certain vendors. So you want to make sure that you are addressing vendors' concerns as best you can, but you're not saying anything that's inconsistent with what's happening legally and what you're asking the court for authority to do. So understanding the nuances there and the words that you can use to provide assurance to vendors or suppliers or customers, and as it might be, is a real important skill. Because if you, as you said, if you do say the wrong thing and it's inconsistent with what's happening in court, it could create significant problems in terms of credibility and reputation.
Which could ultimately result in the case being, thrown out or not able to move forward. What are some of the downfalls if the communication is not right?
Well, I think it'd be rare for it to a case being thrown out, but you could have a situation where a failure to communicate effectively with key constituents could result in problems. If you are highly dependent upon your vendors and you've misled them, or they don't have the same degree of trust in you, and don't want to continue doing business with you, that could compromise your ability to continue to operate and generate revenue that will support the ongoing business and the funding of a plan. If you've not communicated effectively with your customers and you lose trust, that could also compromise the business. If you tell your employees something about them continuing to be paid or receive their benefits in a certain way that turns out not to be true, you've lost trust with your employees. So the real danger is communicating in a way that decreases credibility and loses trust of your key stakeholders.
So you've been obviously doing this for more than 20 years. Can you talk about maybe a recent restructuring or Chapter 11 case where you felt that the communications aspects were done particularly well, and how you think that helped to further their case?
Well, one that comes to mind, I mentioned earlier that there's been a wave of mass tort bankruptcies over the last several years as companies are more frequently using the Chapter 11 process to address significant mass tort liabilities. I mentioned Johnson & Johnson as an example. There's a number of asbestos cases. Another one I mentioned earlier, which comes to mind is an example of where I think there was really effective communications is Boy Scouts of America, which filed a couple of years ago with a whole history of sexual abuse claims, decades, and they filed primarily to address those claims. This is one of those cases that was as big of a bigger crisis and reputational issue than a financial and restructuring issue. They did a very good job of communicating why they were taking the action that they did, while also conveying contrition, empathy for the people who were affected by the victims of the abuse, and committing to fixing the problem. They made it very clear that they were taking this action because they felt it was the best way to address the claims of the people affected, and also to ensure that they can continue to operate for many years to come. They were clear about their plan for compensating, and they also protected their reputation, I think, as best they could in the way they communicated contrition and empathy, which in any crisis is as paramount as anything in terms of strategic communication. So it's a very difficult situation, lots of emotion and a very unpleasant topic, but with all of those factors, I think communicating around their Chapter 11 filing while they were doing it and using that as an opportunity to, from a reputational standpoint, do as much as they could in terms of communications to preserve their reputation or to try to restore it. I think they did a fantastic job, and they used their website very well, and they used direct communications, and I think that's, and at least in terms of recent history, I think a very good example of effective communication strategy.
Well, it sounds like we might be expecting some more restructurings and Chapter 11 cases in the near term, based on our conversation. And it sounds like these are all very sensitive situations that require convergence of disciplines, legal, the company itself to be involved, and of course the communications piece. So it just it sounds like a very interesting time for our line of work, but also for the industry as well. So I just want to say thanks for taking the time to talk about this topic, and it's been very informative, and it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure as well. Thanks for taking the time, Matt.
Okay.
Enjoyed it.